Hi, good evening. Welcome to High Arts. This is a presentation of Sleep, the Last Frontier. My name is Traber, pronouns she, her. I am Curator-in-Residence at High Arts. I am currently in Brooklyn, also ancestral Lenape lands. I am a light brown skinned Black woman with gold wire frame glasses, poofy curly hair on top of my head, a tan shirt, and behind me are some shelves with plants, and I'm sitting in a pink chair. And tonight we are pleased to provide ASL interpretation through First Choice Interpreting, and we thank our interpreters Cheryl and later Antonio for their interpretation services. So what are we doing tonight? We are talking about sleep, the last frontier, as we said, and there's a provocative question. Do you feel safe when you sleep? How has rest eroded due to grief, terror, and racial violence? In her month-long durational performance, High Arts Marketing Associate, artist, and educator Eleanor Kipping has made her daily afternoon naps virtually available to audiences as a meditation on surveillance, police brutality, and the colonization of sleep in the age of COVID-19. Joining Eleanor tonight in this virtual discussion is also interdisciplinary artist and community organizer Ashley Page. Together, they'll explore the racial sleep divide and the impact that has on BIPOC communities today. So to get us started, I want to invite the artists to share a little bit more about their distinct and incredibly compelling work. First up, I welcome Eleanor Kipping.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. So I'm going to share a little bit of my work before we get going. Can everybody hear me okay? I think so. Erin, if you wouldn't mind playing my short, nope, the other one, that would be great. Thank you. All right, so my name is Eleanor Kipping. My pronouns are she, her, and I am currently on Muncie, Lenape, and Canarsie territory, commonly known as Brooklyn, which is where I live. And I also spent a lot of time in the Penobscot territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy, commonly known as Maine. Oh, let me just, the next slide here. So I also am the Marketing Associate at High Arts, and I always name this in my introductions because I definitely considered my artistic administrative practice as a big part of my practice, and I never try and skip over that. So my interdisciplinary practice explores the experience of the Black female body in the diaspora United States through the examination and deconstruction of historical and contemporary narratives. I am interested in the public, private, and civic negotiations of race, gender, and class, in addition to the effects and practice of violence and their surveillance on the body. My hybrid practice exists as performance, video, photography, poetry and spoken word, collaborative education, educational collaboration, installation, and writing. And the work that I'm going to talk about tonight, which I'll go in more detail later, is sleep streams, which I did sort of in collaboration with High Arts as a part of the High Health 2021 campaign, in which I streamed all of my naps from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. daily every day of the month. So I'm just going to leave it at that and pass it on, and we'll be revisiting this later.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Eleanor and Kira. This is incredible. My name is Ashley Page. I am an artist, a community organizer, somebody who can't sit still, and somebody whose hands are truly never satisfied. I'm presently on Wabanaki land, also known as Portland, Maine. I am in the artist studios of Indigo Arts Alliance. So I'm seated, wearing a striped shirt with 2 buns in my hair with a yellow and orange scrunchie. And I am very pleased to be here with you today. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about the ways in which I use my practice, not only as a meditation on the Black experience, but also as a way to, be present in my body, whether that's physically, spiritually, and emotionally, and conceptually. And so my work is focused on craft and basketry and fiber, as well as paper and steel. And so I use these modes of textiles and weaving and coiling and binding to really sort of unpack and relearn and understand my position in space, and also as an opportunity to relearn and to reconfigure and reshape what space looks like, and how does my physical body inhabit it, but then also how does my work almost serve as a stand-in. And so a lot of what I do and what I make is based in fiber and in textiles, but then it's also, you know, weaving together stories and voices and memories and opportunities for learning and growth. So with that, I'd like to play a short film. And so this work for me is something that I think about quite often, and I kind of always return to it. You know, this harbor and a place holder for memory, and how do our bodies serve as such. You know, I think about what our relationship is to knowledge and stories and histories, whether learned, experienced through secondhand or through firsthand, but then also how does it pass through us generationally? What is our relationship with generational knowledge and knowing and unknowing, and how do we process these things, and how do they sit within us, and how do we continue them and to bring them forward and to recontextualize them. And so, you know, I think a lot about the door of no return, of which through we passed, and so much was lost, and also so much was almost gained in a way, of an opportunity to reinsert and reimagine what the Black identity and the Black body does and looks like, right? And so I'm really sort of in a space of reinvention and re-opportunity. And so I think that with this particular conversation, I'm really looking forward to talking to Eleanor about her work and diving deeper into that. So thank you.
Thank you both so much. Such compelling work that we could spend a whole hour on each, at least. I wanna ask a little bit more about sleep streams, but before I do, I just want to ask you both, in the spirit of this event and this conversation that we're starting, how's your sleep?
I had a bad dream the other night, actually, and it's because I watched a spooky movie, and I woke up in the middle of it, and I've never been one to sleep through the night all the way. And I'm much more of a night owl, and, you know, I think with work and life, I have to sort of be on a daily schedule, but it's been interesting. It's been an interesting ride so far.
How about you, Eleanor? How's your sleep?
Before I say my sleep, do you mind if I do my description? I failed to do that.
Please do. Yeah, you can do both.
Thank you so much. I am a light-skinned brown woman with a big poof pineapple natural ponytail. I'm wearing blue cat eye glasses and a brown top with yellow-ish decor, and behind me is a bookshelf and a beautiful bouquet of flowers. I don't know what kind they are. All right, great. So my sleep's been pretty terrible, which is why we're here today. It's been a roller coaster this year, and I can't seem to find balance, I think is, yeah.
And absolutely, like, thank you both for sharing. And it's a vulnerable question, but it's a vulnerable conversation that you invited us into, Eleanor, by starting this project. And so I wanted to go ahead and put us on a limb there. And I'll just share also, I had terrible sleep. And when I spoke to Eleanor in prep for this event, I was sort of hit with what she introduced me to, which is this racial sleep divide, something I wasn't quite aware of as a chronic insomniac. Didn't realize that I was in really good company. And there's quite a lot that I think you'll get into later that really is still haunting me, not quite keeping me awake at night, because I would be anyways. Eleanor, can you talk a little bit more about how you came up with the concept for this sleep streams? Why you arrived at this idea and how you structured the month-long? Yeah.
So while I talk, I'm going to ask that my second video is played to just sort of be the backdrop of my talk here, my conversation. So what you're watching here is 30 hours of sleep compressed into about 3 minutes. Each clip's about 7 seconds long. So a couple of years ago, I heard the phrase sleep is the last frontier. And I've been really intrigued by that notion, and it never really left me. It sort of kept nagging at me, and I didn't really do anything with it until now. The last frontier being one that's like suggesting that sleep is one of the only human experiences that has not been completely eroded by capitalism or colonized, in the same way that race, gender, marriage, education, the way that we live, the way that we dress has not been. And in some ways that's true. But in other ways, through time and maturity, I've learned that our identities very much inform that experience, and that colonialism and capitalism is very much a part of that experience. And so I really wanted to investigate that and what that meant. And I think when I first heard that statement, I was like, well, no one's going to I can't buy my dreams yet. I'm waiting for that day. You know, I think that's like a disturbing future, is like, here's my credit card. This is the dream I want to have tonight. But so this year, between COVID, financial stress, I had to move. I was one of many who had to move this year during the pandemic. Racial grief and trauma through the murders of our community members, and other personal family issues that I had to deal with, I stopped sleeping. And I never had issues with sleeping, or at least I didn't think that I did. Now in reflection, I'm like, oh, being a night owl actually might have been due to stress and trauma and things that I wasn't really articulating or relating to sleep. And so, as many of us were, I was profoundly disturbed by the murder of Breonna Taylor. And I think I thought about her every single day. I'm going to get emotional thinking about her now. And so I saw this as an opportunity. High Arts started talking about this High Health campaign, and I had only been at High Arts for a few months. And I was like, hey, I have this idea. Will you humor me? And they did. And they enthusiastically supported me in this endeavor. And I thought that at first I was like, this might just be an interesting memorial to Breonna. It might give me an opportunity to explore my identity in relation to her while thinking about police brutality and violence and sort of processing this year. But of course, research began to develop, and I'm still very much in that. I would not say I'm an expert on this by any means. Just want to preface that as we get going. And so, I was like, well, let me just dedicate my entire month to sleeping. And we're in a highly isolated situation, a highly digital and virtual space right now. And so I just decided to embrace that, which is something I was sort of reluctant to do in my performance. And so I went with it, and here we are.
Thank you so much. And for if in case anyone watching isn't quite clear, Breonna Taylor is one of many folks who were murdered by the police, some also civilians, in 2020. And in her case, the police showed up at her house in the middle of the night while she was asleep, shot firearms into her house, and she was killed in her bed asleep. And so there is a direct correlation there in that particular story, but then you're also drawing on broader ideas of the way racial violence, racial terror, and grief keeps Black people from sleeping. Ashley, I know that you work in multi-mediums. You shared a video work, and you evoked sort of the transnational slave trade, but you've also done some recent work in memoriam of some folks who were murdered by the police or civilians for around racial issues. Do you want to speak a little bit to that and like connections you see to Eleanor's work?
Yeah, absolutely. Eleanor, thank you. And I think, you know, so much of this past year has been so illuminating, and also, you know, it's like uncovering the sort of taking the veil off of white complacency, and so and really sort of holding folks accountable. So I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and so I spent, you know, the majority of 2020 home, and so, you know, I was home when George Floyd was murdered, and to see the way in which, you know, the city itself rose against that, and really, you know, I feel like there was another layer of not only accountability, but also awareness, but then also sort of that lack of the day-to-day mundaneness that people seem to like hide behind, and when faced with racial and social injustice. And so, you know, that really not only prompted me to create this work, but then also, you know, it's not an unfamiliar story, the story of George Floyd and the story of Ahmaud Arbery and the story of Breonna Taylor. And so when I'm thinking about, well, maybe I should back up and give a little bit of context as to what the project is. So the project was a series of wheat pasted posters that I created in response to it all, and sort of tangentially just like processing what's happening, not only to myself and, you know, what it feels like to be immersed in that space, but then also what I'm seeing within my community. So I made portraits of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others to follow later on in the summer. And I wheat pasted them all around the city amidst protests and riots, and really sort of, you know, mutual aid benefits, and really sort of seeing the city come together and mourn, but then also reimagine what's next, and sort of dismantling what's there already. And so that's what that work looked like. But it also, you know, when I think about how that felt internally and in the body, but then also like what the city itself looks like, is that, I mean, it was a police state, right? So there were literally helicopters through the night that were just circling. And so you could hear it. And understanding and recognizing, you know, what that does to us, and knowing sort of what that looks like, and not being able to find peace or sleep or rest, and not feeling safe to do so. And also, you know, knowing that, you know, they had a police enforced curfew, and so you weren't able to be out past 8, but then knowing that there are still people out past 8. And so many of those were my friends and people that I was close to. And so seeing them, you know, on either highways or on the news, but then also knowing that that particular series of events had drawn out another sort of counter-protest crowd of white supremacists who were driving up from, you know, all of the points of the country, just to incite and just to antagonize, and knowing that they were there too. And there were nights where, there were like unmarked pickup trucks that were just like revving up and down the streets. And so knowing that, under the cover of darkness, they feel safe. But in the light of day, that's when the community is really sort of coming together. But then also, how do we harness that and use that at night? But not being able to, I think, is such a tactic. And so that's really, sort of a lot of where this is landing for me is thinking about how peace and sleep and rest and recuperation has been denied for Black and brown bodies and people. And, even our immigrant brother and sisters, the role that ICE plays and doing night raids and coming to folks in their most sort of vulnerable states, and what does that do, and how does that feed the lack of well, not only the disruption of, but then also the destabilization of somebody's day to day is just it lands and it doesn't land easy.
Yeah, and Eleanor, I know that in your research, prepping for this project, these are not just social political issues, these are health determinant issues. Can you speak a little bit more to what you've been learning about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Ashley. Really, really appreciate that. So I think one of the most disturbing things that I found, so there is definitely a sleep divide, and it's racial. And there's unfortunately, not a huge amount of research has been done on this. It's beginning to increase as especially more people of color enter the field and begin to research this. But that folks of color, Black folks specifically, are getting at least an hour less of sleep a night. And that African-American children are 4 to 6 times as more likely to have sleep apnea. African-American adults are 88% more likely to have sleep apnea. And this is just one condition. And it's no secret either that Black folks, Black communities are plagued by diabetes, high cholesterol, hypertension, obesity, all of the things that we're trying to tackle, but there's very little research that is being done to link it to sleep. But all of the research that is being done that links it to sleep finds that there is a direct correlation between our body's ability to fight off these conditions. And so Black folks are more likely to live in communities that are louder. They may have to work more jobs. They might be sleeping less in general. There's definitely more surveillance in these neighborhoods, as we all know. But this, even if that isn't the case, if you live in a space that's quiet and safe and all of those things, we're still Black, and we're still dealing with discrimination in the workplace, in every social space that we enter. And so that alone is keeping us awake. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, because that really rocked my world when you shared that research with me. And so when I go back, Ashley, to what you described in your own home community and what you're also, experiencing via your friends and colleagues who are have a fear of ICE because of immigration issues, to think that it's not just, oh, this is unjust, this is unfair. It's like physiologically, it is changing our bodies. Mm-hmm. And it's really overwhelming. And you both are taking an approach as artists to bring this to the fore, to discuss, to do what? What are you trying to do with your work, do you think? And how do you see your work in conversation with each other? Either one can respond to that.
I can start, or Ashley, would you like to start?
Why don't you start? I'm super curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think to answer the question of what am I trying to do, for me, it was just to figure out why I couldn't sleep and to find a reason to dive a little deeper to this sort of like thing that was nagging me. Because I know, we know when there's something off, and something was off. And I was like, I need to dig into that. And then it's like, turned into this frontier. And I think frontier is like a really appropriate word, because it's like, we can spend an hour talking about surveillance. We can spend an hour talking about health. like there's about police brutality and violence, about the virtual tech space that we're in, all of those things. So it's literally a frontier to be understood. And so I wanted to start scratching at that surface formally. So that was the first thing. And I will say this is the first piece of this kind that I've done in my practice. And when I say of this kind, I mean that exists in a virtual space and that hinges on that, like that medium is critical to its success. And that was really intentional, because I could have just recorded them. I didn't. I wanted it to be accessed through that way and to create this power dynamic, to really heighten my vulnerability. And so I met Ashley virtually, sort of, through this exhibition that we're both in at the Portland Museum of Art. And I was really drawn to her work, and I started digging a little deeper, and I was really moved by the In Memoriam piece, and that wasn't the piece that was in the show, that's at the Portland Museum of Art. I was really interested in that piece because my memorial is strange and unusual and public facing. And I think in a really contemporary and kind of exciting way that we don't often see, but also sort of disturbing. And hers was so beautiful. And so that was the entry point for me. And then just the more I read about her work, I was like, I really want to talk to her about this. And then there's, I'm from Maine originally, and being from Maine as a Black person is hard. And here's this woman who is succeeding in Maine and choosing to live in Maine. And I was like, I definitely need to talk to her. And here's an excuse. And so I reached out, and she said yes. So yeah, I'll stop there and let her speak.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so many thoughts. Oh, Kirya, that's such a good question. But honestly, I think so much of my work is really just an attempt to process and to meditate and to sort of reconvene internally and like actually just like touch base with myself and be like, are we okay? We're okay. But then also, looking at sort of the larger global and just not even so much as global, but just more so my community and my environment and really sort of processing and understanding what I need from it, right? And also how can I use my voice and my methods of making and methods of organizing and sort of, methods of, all of it, to be able to give back. And sometimes that's the most selfish thing I can do, it feels, whether or not it's organizing because I need to see people or bringing people together because I need them in one space, because I have to, I think that people bring a certain kind of energy and it's just it's so needed, especially in a space like Maine. And to be able to be around people who look like you and people who don't look like you and for an opportunity to learn from one another and to share and to exchange is really sort of the way in which I use my practice. And, I think of my practice not only as my studio work, but then also what I do in an arts administration role at Indigo Arts Alliance as the studio programs coordinator, and being able to reach out and to use the resources that are available to me or that are offered to me, either through partnerships and collaborations to really sort of make an honest reflection and create an honest reflection of my environment, and also recognizing when I don't see it, and so often in spaces and institutions and organizations, you don't see it, of like looking at sort of the larger global, like what's outside of the building is not usually what's in it. And so I think at Indigo, that's a really sort of uniquely not the case. It being a Black-led and Black-founded organization. So truly snaps to that. But then, I think the intersection in which Eleanor so beautifully articulated between both of our work is not only that mode of processing and understanding, but then also, that looking outwards and looking inwards at the same time. And the work that I showed earlier, the video piece, is looking outwards, and so is that memorial piece. I did it because it's what got me through the day, and it's because it's what I felt like I needed to do. And so often those are it just feels like basic survival. And so what I have on view at the PMA is, they're vessels, and they are bodies, and they are suspended, and they are abstracted, crocheted, wax dipped pods, and opportunities that I see and that I spend time with. And that's how I experience them, and that's how I make them. And that was what I was thinking about when creating it and growing this sort of field of work. So I hope that answered that question, but there's so much there.
I think there was a lot there. I want to actually surface a little more about the different communities that you're both referring to. I think there's we've talked about hypervigilance that comes from surveillance in an urban setting. Particularly, you evoked like the Minneapolis environment after George Floyd was murdered. And that's something that is very commonly imagined in popular culture, like the sort of like the urban city center, the helicopters, the cars at 24/7 hours a day, 7 days a week. But then there's also the Black experience in a place like Portland, Maine, which is you're referencing, but I don't know that everybody who's watching has a context for. And I'm wondering if you both could speak to that a little bit and how that shaped your experience. Eleanor, you growing up, and Ashley, you presently, how that might show up in your understanding of this like sleep disruption and surveillance, and also in your art.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've only lived here for about 5 years now. So I came from a place in which I was not forced to contend with my identity, or that like polar opposite, or like not, of being necessarily the only in a space in which I have here in Portland. And I think having gone to a arts education institution sort of only puts you in a smaller bubble, and so it's like, upon moving here, I think it took me a good 1.5 years to wrap my head around the unsettling nature of feeling like, the not only the only, but then also, it almost felt like, you're not real to some people. It feels like, they're like, oh, I've never met another person, or it's like, I've only seen this on TV, and it's like, it's so on a part of their day-to-day reality. And, what that feels like on a day-to-day sort of basis, and trying to, not only like figure yourself out, but then also to figure out how you exist in this kind of landscape, was, feeling like I was incredibly visible and invisible at the same time. Because there was this hyper awareness and this like need for, I would see people sort of alter their behavior or their language, or like the way that they would sort of move in a space when in context with like Black or brown people. But then also like in the removal of that, it's like a totally different sort of relationship. And so or even just as simple as walking down the street. And, it's like you notice that people are like a little bit, there's another layer of surveillance that I'm still, that's still unsettling in its own ways. But it's something that I've sort of come to a place in which I don't want to say I'm not taking it personally anymore, but it's like, you adapt in the ways that you have to. And so, I think that there are ways to deal with that. And there are ways to contend with that. And I use, my work and, when I was talking about that mode of reflection and how I see, there's a very large immigrant community here in Portland that I feel like a lot of people do not, there is no, there's no acknowledgement of that. Or like, there's still a little lack of mixing, which I'm not sure if that's that doesn't necessarily feel like the right term, but
it's segregated. Does that feel accurate?
Yeah, actually, and it feels like that when I say that invisibility versus hypervisibility, there's that layer of invisibility in like the public or like the ideas of community and the organizing and the emergence, but then there's also that hypervisibility in terms of like, just day-to-day living. Of just always sort of feeling like you're either on or, always, and this is also a product of a small town, going somewhere where you're not anonymous in any way. And so maybe Eleanor can speak a little bit to, what that's been like growing up here, because I'm sure that that's a real thing. And that's just what I've sort of observed and have experienced in the time that I've spent here. So, yeah.
Oh, I don't even know where to begin. So many things. Yeah, so the first term that came to mind was hypervisibility, and that is something that Ashley and I spoke about in our private conversations. And oh gosh, so Ashley is in Portland, and the town that I went to high school and middle school and that my family land is on is 3 hours north, and it's probably the last sort of city before you enter the 100-acre woods, which is a thing. So it's even smaller, and it's even more rural, and the POC population is even smaller, and I think just as transient, perhaps. And my piece at the PMA actually talks a lot about that, like land ownership and indigenous land, and sort of the burden and privilege and guilt and all of the things that come with that. And I think that speaks to a lot of my experience as a mixed race Black woman in a rural space. Oh gosh, I don't even know where to go. So I left Maine to get away from it, and ironically, that's the place where I realized that I wasn't getting sleep, which is supposed to be this idyllic, hyper safe sort of haven, and in a lot of ways it is, but I felt so invisible, and I'm speaking mostly to this last year, but I definitely struggled with it as a child as well. In school, especially as I got older and I learned that I was Black and what that meant. And then realized that I am Black enough because I'm Black and this is my experience, and therefore this is a part of the Black experience. But so during the protests and being stuck in Maine for some personal family reasons, I felt hyper visible because it felt like as if when I walked into public, I was this slate upon which to project every violent image or image that is difficult to process and understand. Regardless of where you are in this political spectrum, it's incredibly hard to watch violence, or these notions of violence or presentations of violence. I even use that word really hesitantly, because that's a whole nother conversation. But I was this slate upon which to project it. And so people would look at me and see a murder, or a person being murdered by the police. And I would, like locals would say, "How are you? Aren't you great? Are you so happy you're in Maine?" And I'm like, "No." And they could not see. So, and there was the invisibility, is that they could not understand that my experience was so much informed by a reality, and a fear and grief and trauma. And that's like hyper present. That doesn't even touch on, past experience, a lifetime of experiences. That's just one summer, essentially. So I will say I really appreciate Ashley talking about how reflection is a part of your practice. I don't name that in sort of my formal articulation of my work. And you're teaching me to, and I really appreciated that through this month that we've been talking. And I'm thinking a lot about how to articulate that in my own work, because you're right. We're both doing it. We're looking at the sort of micro. I describe it as like sort of the micro, the macro, and like the individual, and then the larger socio-political context that reflection is framed, within.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to name that and appreciate that. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Just like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I asked you to locate your geographic experiences in this conversation about Blackness, surveillance, and sleep, and you both spoke to that. Absolutely. I really want to ask. So we've evoked surveillance, we've evoked hypervigilance, hypervisibility, not being able to sleep, and processing grief and fear through the art. Having a reflective practice, a practice of reflection. Sorry, you could probably hear my dog barking enthusiastically. And memorial. So there's the internal work of your art, how it's helping you process and reflect, and then the external, a public memorial, a memorial you're sharing. And there's ways that your art speaks to each other and is similar, and there's ways that it's quite different. I'm curious what questions you have for each other as makers, as Black women, as people with disrupted sleep who are grieving collectively in this moment. What questions do you have for each other?
That's such a good one. I feel like, I feel like just being sort of, I imagine, and I consider myself, that type of person who's just like a lifelong learner in a lot of ways. And so I think even just sort of being in sort of in space, but then also in conversation and in conceptualization with everybody here is always so valuable. And so I'm wondering, I so silly. I want to like ask, how are you guys doing? But then I also want to ask, how are you finding and reclaiming those moments and that hypervisibility and invisibility back for yourself? Because I think that's something that I think about a lot, and that I'm trying to like process and think about, and also contend with, I think, in a lot of different ways. But I'm curious about what that looks like for both of you, honestly.
Can you say that again?
How do you reclaim and contend with the hypervisibility and invisibility, whether or not that's in self-care practices or in your work, or in your organizing and education practice? But I'm wondering what that looks like for you.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's different every day, right? that's a really tough one. I think like on a really sort of day-to-day self-care level, it was joining High Arts, and making a decision to join an organization that reflected my person, and my values and would enhance the work that I was already doing, which here we are, right? Like having this conversation about, and the starting point was an idea that I had. So I think that's working. I think I'm still trying to answer it in terms of finding safety. That's something I'm really thinking about a lot, especially since I'm sort of in the depths of this piece and sort of quite disturbed by it, actually, and the effects that sleeping every day in the same hour and being watched while doing it has had on me, while also adjusting to living in Bushwick. That was a new move, which in a lot of ways I did so I could become invisible, but also be seen by my people, essentially, and my neighbors. I lived in a white neighborhood in New York before I came here, and one neighbor, a person of color, knew my name. No, it was two. It's both people of color. And I was there for almost 2 years. And here, within the first few weeks, my entire block knew my name. And so placing myself here was incredibly intentional, despite, the fact that there's a police car 24 hours, 3 blocks up the street. And there's been, violence that has taken place, harm that folks have done to each other, which is incredibly painful to witness and hear, to literally hear, without going into graphic detail. That's so hard. That's so hard. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not necessarily looking for answers, but more so just co-thought.
Yeah. I don't think there is an answer. And it, like I said, I think it changes every day. And will look different in a year, just like it looks different now than it did a year ago.
Right.
Yeah, and then connecting with like folks like you. I don't know if I'm really answering that. That's so, yeah. What about yourself?
Oh goodness, I don't even know how to begin answering that question, honestly. Reclaiming hypervisibility. You know what? Honestly, what it looks like a lot of is that, and I don't know if this is like something that you guys have gotten lately either, but I found that being in Portland and there's like such a small Black art-based community, that it's been like people come to you for a lot.
Yeah.
And they tap you for things and they're like, do you want to do this? Will you do this? Will you do this? Will you tell me how to do this? Do you want to speak at this thing? Do you want to partner on this thing? And it feels like, and especially, and this was so heightened, I feel, last summer, in which people were like, oh my God, I have to take accountability for my, for white complacency. So let me reach out to like the people that I know, not only to see if they're okay, but then also to see if they want to do something, if they want to partner, if I can put them on our Instagram, like going about it in that way. And I feel like that's where hypervigilance and hyper visibility for me really felt like a lot. Of people who, I've never spoken to before or have never been, or who are just now taking the time to do these things, or initiating task forces and all of this stuff. And so I feel like that's where that reflection comes in for me of being incredibly mindful of where I'm spending my energy.
Yes.
And, you know, where I'm spending my money, right? Capitalism. How, you know, who I'm supporting and how I'm doing it, and what makes the most amount of sense for me, but then also, you know, recognizing certain things for what they are, in terms of either opportunity or resource.
Yeah.
And also, like, how do I give it to other people who have not either seen themselves there or see themselves as having this space or this thing, but then also, I think, just being aware, and using it for what it is. That's sort of how I've been sitting with it lately. And as for hyper invisibility, what that means for me is when people who have never reached out or done anything, for the Black and brown community or with the Black and brown community, or just in general of like recognizing any sort of general privilege or like using their resources previously to like the past 3 months, 6 months. And I think seeing that, but then also the hyper invisibility there lies for me in the naivete that I've been sort of exposed to on a new layer. And you know, people not recognizing what it is that they're doing, when they keep, like, you know, for example, there's a restaurant here called Yardy Tang that's like one of the only Jamaican restaurants like in Portland, and they went through a time where, you know, they were orders out of the door, constantly getting flooded with business, and then after a certain point, you know, it just stopped, and they were like, whoa, okay, what now? I just hired the stuff, I bought all the stuff, I did all of these things because I thought this was going to be consistent. Now it's quiet and there's nothing, you know. That inconsistency, I feel. And so yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
You graciously invited me into the conversation, and I'm not going to fully insert myself, but I do want to provide a little nugget actually from a friend, Anushka Ratnaraja, who's actually a theater artist based in Canada, who years ago we had a conversation where she talked about herself, like myself and Eleanor, maybe different from you. Ashley grew up in a majority white community as a brown person, South Asian, Black for me, and for Eleanor. How she took to the stage because she was so viewed constantly in the way that you so expertly described, Ashley, of like everybody sees you constantly, and they're also don't know you at all. They also can't imagine you outside of what they've seen in popular culture and TV. So they see you constantly, you stand out constantly, and yet they don't know you at all. That's that hyper visibility, invisibility talking about. And Anushka talked about, well, then I had to become an artist so that I could control the narrative. So I could say, well, you're looking anyways, look at this.
Yeah.
Look at this. How about this? And so where I think, Ashley, you might locate yourself a little differently in that because you didn't grow up in an entirely white community. You did go to white school. You talked about the way that becoming an artist in and of itself is an exercise in reclaiming. Okay, we have a question from an audience I'd love to bring in. Eleanor, have you had a moment to reflect on how your current project, Sleep's Last Frontier, might influence future works? And Ashley, are you working on anything new?
I'm so glad you asked. Yes, absolutely. And so I'm thinking about this idea of surveillance and continuing to explore this Zoom thing or this virtual thing, but busting through the sort of like format that we're all familiar with, which is this little square thing that we're looking at right now. And actually, we talked about this. All of us talked a little bit about this panopticon sort of relationship to the piece. And real quick, for those who may not know, it's a structure, it's a prison or disciplinary structure in which prison cells are in a circular format, and they're looking in at a center tower, and the guard can see them, but they cannot see the guard. And so Ashley was actually the one that pointed out this relationship to me and my viewer when I was in these sleep situations, because in most of them I can't see who's watching me because of the way I've pinned my screen. Sometimes I forgot, so I can see, and sometimes I didn't. But the anxiety of always the potential of being seen and knowing that I could be watched, and how that ties into everything going on in the world today and data and all of those things. So I'm really, 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 really interested in continuing to explore that through this virtual space in like a multi-camera setting on one body. I don't want to give away all my brilliance, but that is something that I am very, very excited about continuing to explore after I rest a little, ironically, because this has actually been exhausting. Sleep every day in the middle of the day for an hour has really thrown me off, and I can't wait for it to be done. One more day. Yeah, I'll throw it to Ashley.
Yeah, well, first of all, Eleanor, I'm excited. I'm excited for you to get some rest. And I'm also excited to see how it evolves. But right now, yeah, I mean, I'm working on, I should say, tangentially to my studio practice, in which I'm working on some baskets. So this is like a little wire basket that looks like this. Oh, there we go. That looks like this, and then I coat it in a paper, and then it rusts, which creates this like really sort of tasty patina. And I'm sort of looking at vessel making and how sort of the basket serves as a stand-in for the body, and how do we sort of absolve ourselves of a representational image and sort of distill ourselves down into this like skeletal form thing. But then also I'm curating right now. So that's a pretty big component of what I do, is not only the making, but then also contextualizing it, and putting it in relation to other people, and putting other people in the same room, and like in relation to one another has been really, really rewarding. And it sort of allows me to have an opportunity to not only, share my work, but then also share other people, which has been feels really good and feels really right. So I have some things coming up that I'm excited about, and then I'm still like percolating and processing, but yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thank you both for that. I want to close out on one final question, which is, what for each of you is your most radical vision of rest for yourself and your communities?
I'll start so that way Eleanor can close out. And I want to see everybody carefree and well-fed and well-rested and comfortable. I think that so much of what we've been talking about and thinking about is lack of security. And I think that in, the most fantastical and ideal world, all of our basic needs would be met, and we would be able to start off well in the ways that we should, without having to think about like how to, pay rent or feed ourselves or clothe ourselves or go to work or any of that. Like that would all just dissolve, and we would all be able to like just, focus on what the body needs, and what makes the body feel good, right? Whether that's dancing or moving or making or tinkering or reading, we would just sort of be able to be. And so that's right. That's what I'd like to see.
I mean, you said it. I think because you said radical, I can name some of the institutions that we you might want to get rid of. Like, we all need our houses. We all need free food. We all need free healthcare. We don't need police. We need community-centered everything. Yeah, so that way we can all just be artists and play and laugh and love, and to not have to work and to not have to hunt for our food anymore would be lovely, and to focus on enriching our bodies and our minds and our relationships would just be lovely. To just essentially eradicate all of the things that's causing no sleep to begin with. Yeah, I can't really, she said it.
Well, I hope we all dream of such a time tonight. Thank you both for spending time sharing with each other and with the rest of us. If you've been following along, you can see links to both of the artists' websites in the comments, and also you can follow more about this event and High Health 2021, which there's still at least one other event, maybe two more in. At higharts.org or on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We have a presence all over the web. So thank you both so much. And I hope that everyone watching gets some good rest tonight.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
This was a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, everybody. And thank you to High Arts and Eleanor and Kira. This was a pleasure.
And thank you again to our interpreters from First Choice Interpreting.
Thank you. Sweet dreams, everybody.
Have a good night.